Now, during the 1980s and with the explosion of home video, action movies became big business in Hollywood, and everybody got a chance to be an action star, including Carl Weathers when he would take the lead in the 1988 cult classic Action Jackson, an exploitation action romp filled with bad jokes, big action, tasteful nudity, and Weathers dropping clumsy one-liners like a Pez dispenser. So let's get into how this movie was made, how it holds up today, and why it sadly never turned into an action franchise for Carl Weathers. Hey, what's up out there, everybody? Thank you guys, as always, for stopping by the channel. I'm Anthony DeGioia. This is Movies Never Say Die, your home for 80s and 90s retro content. Now, as I said, there were no shortage of action movies on the back half of the 1980s. The genre really would boom with a fresh generation of action stars, as Stallone and Schwarzenegger would take the mantle from legends like Eastwood and Bronson, which would then lead to others like Gibson and Willis and Van Damme and Seagal and many others, all getting their little space in the genre to drop some hits. And then came Carl Weathers, a man seemingly fit for the action genre. He was beloved as Apollo Creed, but after the character's death in Rocky IV at the hands of Drago, his run had come to an end. He also, in my opinion, felt right at home next to Arnold in Predator, who has a big-time action star persona, but at that time in '87, he had still yet to get his chance. And I'm sure there was some racism he had to endure. There weren't any other black leads in studio action films at that time, and really there wouldn't be with any consistency until Wesley Snipes during the 90s, and I think Weathers was literally built like an action figure. He was due for a solo turn, and he was in his prime to close out the 80s, so his timing seemed perfect for his leading role in Action Jackson.
Chill out.
Because I think he felt right at home as Sergeant Jericho Jackson, a man of urban legend in Detroit who crosses paths with a sleazy auto magnate played by Craig T. Nelson named Peter Delaplane, who's using a shadowy group of assassins known as the Invisible Men to kill off Union officials who aren't on his side. Jackson and Delaplane also have a past as well, because Jackson roughed up Delaplane's crazy son during a bust, which resulted in Jackson getting a demotion. So naturally, there's already some built-up animosity there, and with the help of Delaplane's heroin-addicted, lounge-singing mistress, played by the late Canadian pop singer Vanity, Jackson will drop cheesy jokes and kick ass all the way to the top to stop Delaplane from succeeding in his evil scheme. It's a story that admittedly goes through the typical genre progression, so yes, it's as tonally sporadic and cliche-filled as you would expect, which surprisingly for the case of Action Jackson, actually makes it better when rewatching as an adult.
How? Send him an engraved invitation. Look, kid, you come on down here. Join us at City Jail. Dress casual, RSVP.
You really tore that boy's arm off.
So, he had a spare.
Now, it's far from a great movie. You don't sit down for something called Action Jackson looking for a deep character study. The jokes are cheesy and the story is basic, but it's filled with action, and Nelson delivers a scene-stealing performance as the sleazy villain. It also has a fast pace, it doesn't take itself too seriously, and despite Weathers feeling a bit too stiff on the comedic side, it's a charming relic of action movies from the 1980s. Surprisingly enough, the idea for Action Jackson actually came from Carl Weathers himself. While on location in Puerto Vallarta filming Predator, he and producer Joel Silver discovered this shared love of 70s blaxploitation films. Silver essentially told Weathers to put something together, so Weathers came up with the idea for the character and the general concept, and when he mentioned the prospect of the film to a crew member, that crew member, in showing interest in wanting to work on the project, said he was in like Action Jackson, and from there the title was cemented.
Why do they call you Action?
Weathers would present his concept to Joel Silver, who would then bring in Robert Renault to write a screenplay. It would be jointly produced by Silver Pictures and Lorimar Film Entertainment, who Weathers was already under contract with at the time. Lorimar already had a deal in place for Warner Brothers to handle their distribution, so production was underway. Filming would last the month of May in 1987, with production outside of establishing shots of Detroit taking place in and around Los Angeles, California. And when it was completed, Action Jackson would land quietly into theaters on February 12, 1988, earning just $5.4 million to take the number 3 spot. However, it would hold in the box office top 10 for a solid 4 weeks to finish with a respectable $20.2 million on just a $7 million budget. And like many movies during this era, it thrived financially on VHS tape. There was a time when VHS movies were $59.99 and people were buying them up, so Action Jackson certainly was a financial success. So why was there never any sequel?
I know you're a very proud man, and you have much to be proud of. High school track star, Harvard law degree. Frankly, if I had a Harvard law degree, I never would have become a policeman.
The simple answer would be that this movie was just a casualty of business circumstances and bad timing. As I mentioned, Lorimar handled the production, and during the 70s and much of the 80s, they were a viable TV production company with massive hits like The Waltons and Knots Landing and Dallas and Falcon Crest, and to say these were massively popular shows at the time would be a gross understatement, but Lorimar had also branched out into motion pictures and music as well, and by the late 80s their company was spread a bit too thin. And towards the end of 1989, less than a year after Action Jackson's release, Sony Pictures would buy out Lorimar and take over the former MGM studio lots to house their Columbia Pictures and TriStar Productions. Lorimar would still produce a few films under Warner Brothers, but eventually they would fold into WB completely in September of '93, so it was just the wrong time for Action Jackson.
Enough is enough!
The intention was for Action Jackson to be a trilogy for Weathers, but the studio dealings and finances would just get in the way of getting us to see more of Sergeant Jackson blowing shit up and saving the day. And after Action Jackson's release, Lorimar was extremely limited financially as a production company, and by the time WB had gotten the catalog of Lorimar's films, and even if there was interest in making a sequel, I think the window for a cheesy action flick with a 70s exploitation vibe had kind of closed by the mid-90s when visual effects were taking over in the genre, which may have actually been a positive for this film. As much as I would have liked a sequel back then, I think Weathers is certainly stiff when delivering the humor, and I'll be the first to admit that it wasn't the most well-written material by any means, but the comedic clunkiness that in this movie lands with a sort of a cheesy charm would have potentially felt a lot more staler had a sequel came out a year or two after its release. I think Weathers certainly deserved a larger place in the action genre, but maybe not as Action Jackson, unless the writing on both the dialogue side and the story layering side bulked up a little bit to match Weathers' physique. As I mentioned, Lorimar had also branched into music when they formed Lorimar Records back in '79. The soundtrack for Action Jackson, featuring music from Herbie Hancock and the Pointer Sisters and Vanity herself, would actually be the final release for the label. Vanity also has a couple of overextended musical performances in the movie that, to be honest, are just comically cringe. Really, they're just a silly timestamp of pop music during the era, and oddly enough, these dance moves were choreographed by Paula Abdul, who had a huge year in 1988, also doing the choreography for Coming to America and Big, but I don't know, these rusty looking dance moves are just amazing for all the wrong reasons. Vanity and Weathers would also appear in the Pointer Sisters music video for the film's theme song, He Turned Me Out, which is just another nostalgic timestamp to the era when music blended much more with cinema. And when looking back at Action Jackson, I think you can appreciate the nostalgia of just a different era in action movies. The simple story is told in an unnecessarily incohesive way, but it's still more than enough to connect all the fun action sequences together. Weathers is chasing down taxis on foot and smashing windshields with his bare hands. He's throwing guys out of buildings and into other buildings, and the practical stunt work is a treat. And Weathers front and center is cool as can be as a smooth cop with a vintage ride and no shortage of bad jokes. And as I mentioned, the movie has a great villain. Craig T. Nelson, while clearly being no match for Weathers physically, is a charmingly sadistic villain. He gets the best lines in the movie, and Nelson delivers them with a Bond villain arrogance that is just perfect for an over-amplified bad guy that will kill anybody that gets in his way. Delaplane is also shown as being a martial arts expert, which in itself is comical, much like these clearly visible stuntmen. But regardless of all that, Nelson holds his own in this movie. He gives it that evil vibe, and he definitely holds his own in the finale, and I would almost say that he kind of steals Action Jackson from Carl Weathers.
I expected a standing ovation.
You're getting one.
Something else in this movie's favor is certainly the sex appeal, with both Sharon Stone and Vanity steaming up the screen. Stone has a smaller role as Delaplane's wife, and Vanity serves as the mistress and wingwoman for Weathers in the plot's main mission. And in true 80s action movie fashion, the film finds any kind of way to shoehorn a topless scene for each of them, so kudos to that. But all joking aside, Action Jackson is a fun movie, and Weathers more than holds his own as a leading man. The action-packed finale is just textbook for the genre, and despite having plenty of bad lines in the film, Weathers does get one classic one to land with a charming gusto that cements this whole film in 80s cinema.
Barbecue, huh? How do you like your ribs?
Growing up, I watched this movie countless times on late night cable. I remember it being filled with so many familiar faces from my other favorite movies at the time, like Landon and Duke showing up from The Predator, as well as 80s stunt icon Al Leong being in there, and Robert Davey and Mary Ellen Trainor, and so many other faces showing up in smaller roles. It just made the movie kind of feel lived in. It's just a fast-paced movie overall. The flaws, I think, are much more comical than they ever are a hindrance to the fun, and I definitely do think Weathers should have gotten an Action Jackson sequel with a better script, just to see if the impact would have been a little bit better. Weathers would star in a film called Dangerous Passion in 1990 that would actually be released as Action Jackson 2 in some European countries, despite having no connection to the film at all. But we'll always have this movie to remember Weathers' moment in the action spotlight, and when he's kicking ass, and this movie is really riding on full cylinders. But sadly, when it's trying to be funny, the result is like nails on the chalkboard. So overall, when all is said and done, I'll give Action Jackson a solid, well-earned C+. And that's it for today, guys. This concludes my retrospective look back at 1988's Action Jackson. Let me know down in the comments what you think of this movie. If you haven't seen it, I'd certainly recommend seeking it out to give it a watch. It's a relic of the past, but in a good way. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I appreciate you all, and until the next video, movies never say die.
This is Jack Burton in the Pork Chop Express, and I'm talking to whoever's listening out there.
Survive a war, you gotta become war.
I suppose we have to register you as a lethal weapon.
You trying to say Jesus Christ can't hit a curveball?